My sophomore year of college was coming to an end. On a hot night during the last week of May, I received a phone call from my mother at the dorm telling me that I would be going home for the summer to help out with the farm. This idea pleased everyone in the family. I wasn't completely convinced, but I consoled myself that it was just a vacation after all. After finishing my last exam, I packed up my things, said goodbye to my friends, and promised to see them in the fall. Most of my friends were doing the same, as they would be going home as well. It took me 3 hours to drive from my school to the farm. Both of my grandparents were over 70 years old, and I knew they needed help with the farm work. My grandfather couldn't bale hay by himself, and there were a million other things that needed to be done. I arrived late in the evening. My grandmother had cooked so much food that the three of us couldn't possibly finish it all. She was so loving and caring towards her grandson. I thought that this affection would fade quickly once I stayed with her for a while, but it didn't. My grandfather wanted to know everything about me. By bedtime, I thought that everything would be fine. After all, I would only have to stay here for one summer. The next morning, my grandfather made breakfast for the two of us. He said that my grandmother was tired from working all day the day before, so she would be resting for a while. I told myself that I wouldn't ask her to do anything for me during my stay. I was here to help, not to be a burden to my grandparents. That morning, my grandfather surprised me. When we left the house, he seemed to come alive and move more fluidly. The farm was his domain. Even though he was old, he still carried himself with confidence as he walked around the property. He no longer looked like the man who had fallen asleep in his chair the night before the 6 o'clock news ended. As we walked through the gate to check on the livestock, he seemed to know each cow personally. And there were nearly 200 in the herd. We didn't actually do much work on the first day, but I was impressed with all that my grandfather had accomplished over the years I hadn't been born. He hadn't received much formal education, but he had raised 4 children into responsible adults thanks to the farm. I was truly impressed by that. Many weeks passed. By June, we had finished baling hay and stacking it in the barn. I was also getting used to working with my grandfather every day. He had everything planned out in his head, and we just had to follow his instructions each day. In the evenings at home, I would read or talk to my grandmother. She never got tired of hearing stories about school or anything else related to me. She also told me about the time she met my grandfather, about his love for her, and about the look in his eyes that she still remembered all these years later. On the last Sunday of June, my grandfather invited me to go fishing because we had finished all our work. The lake was located in a low-lying field near the forest. In previous years, he had stocked the lake with fish. That morning we drove to the lake, taking the opportunity to check on the livestock. We couldn't believe what we saw that morning. One of the swans that my grandfather had given to my grandmother on their golden anniversary was dead. The other one refused to eat and just stared off into the distance. "Why don't we get a new one to replace it?" I suggested, hoping to salvage the situation. After thinking for a moment, he finally said, "No, it's not that easy, son. You know that swans mate for life. Other animals can mate with different partners, but not swans. We can bring in another one, but it won't be able to replace the soulmate it once hoped for, found and understood. There's nothing more we can do for the other swan. It has to figure things out on its own." We caught enough fish for lunch that morning. On the way back, he told me not to tell my grandmother about the swan. She didn't go to the lake much anymore, so there was no point in telling her. A few days later, my grandfather and I were walking past the lake while doing our morning livestock check. We saw the other swan lying in the same spot, where its mate had been found, and it was also dead. My grandfather and I started July by building a new fence. On July 12th, my grandmother passed away. I woke up late that morning, and he didn't knock on my door to wake me up. It was almost 8 o'clock when I finally got dressed and went downstairs. Dr. Morgan was sitting at the kitchen table. He had been our neighbor for years since he retired. He had come over a few times in the past when we needed him. I immediately knew something was wrong. This morning, the doctor's black briefcase was sitting next to his foot, and my grandfather was clearly shaking. My grandmother had died suddenly of a stroke. My parents came over that afternoon. Relatives and friends of my grandparents quickly gathered at our old house. The funeral was held the next day because he insisted on it happening as soon as possible. On the second day after the funeral, he said at breakfast, "This is a busy farm. We still have a lot of work to do. The rest of you should go back to your work." Most of the family had already left, but that was his way of telling everyone it was time to go home. My parents were the last to leave after lunch. My grandfather was not someone who could easily express his pain to others. So we were all worried about him. Everyone was talking about telling him to give up farming. My parents also thought he was too old to live alone there, but he didn't care about that. I was really proud of how he stood up for himself. The rest of the summer passed slowly. We were still busy with work. I vaguely noticed that he was different, but I wasn't sure. I started to wonder if he might be better off living with someone, but I knew he could never leave the farm. September was approaching, but I didn't want to leave. I even considered dropping out of the fall semester to stay with him for a few more months to keep him company. When I brought up this, he immediately objected, saying that my place was in college, not here. Finally, it was time for me to pack my things and leave. I shook his hand and hugged him goodbye. As I drove away, I saw him waving goodbye in the rearview mirror as he turned back to the barn to start his daily chores. That is the image of him that I always cherish in my mind. My mother called me at school on a stormy morning to tell me that he was gone. A neighbor had stopped by for coffee that morning and found him in the kitchen. He had died of a stroke, just like my grandmother. In that moment, I understood what he had been trying to explain to me about the Swan that morning. We went fishing by the lake. Thank you so much for watching and stay blessed.